Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the CyberPod. I'm Kash.
And I'm Tariq.
This is our final episode of the foundational phase of the roadmap series. The series is going to continue in the next episode, but we'll move on to the next phase. In today's episode, we'll talk about vulnerability management, which we'll jump straight into. So what is vulnerability management and why is it important? So I think I'll do the first part about what is vulnerability management and give a little description.
Cool.
Vulnerability management, or known as VM within the security operations space.
The cybersphere.
The cybersphere is the practice and process of checking for weak points within your network and fixing them before an attacker takes advantage and gets in.
Yeah, I think the why it's important side, I think you can list a number of different breaches and security incidents across history for this. I mean, a big example that comes to mind, I think it was around the time I started working actually, was around Equifax, and they had a huge data breach, which I think it was about 147 million consumers' data were exposed because essentially there was a clear vulnerability that they didn't correct in their application, and so that allowed things like personal IDs and other information about their consumers. Being a big insurance provider, they have so much information and personal data. So exploiting that meant that I think it was about 200,000 odd details were leaked. I mean, it's crazy to think that they had customers around the UK, internationally as well. I think it was Britain and Canadian citizens that were affected. But this really sheds a light on not only why it's so important to look at your vulnerability management programs, but actually how it can be viewed externally. So we talked earlier in our podcasting series about things like the DPA, so the Data Protection Act, and the fact that if you don't have adequate controls in place, you can be fined quite a significant sum. And one of the bases for that discussion, because that is can be a very subjective discussion of, okay, did you put adequate controls in place? Is what actually happened? Was it a sophisticated threat actor was able to exploit some 0 days in your environment? It's very difficult to protect against that. Or is it a known vulnerability where you've had adequate amount of time to scan, remediate and resolve that, and you've just not taken the appropriate steps to do so? And that's why they faced quite a significant fine. And I think
just to touch on that point, you said adequate amount of time, and that also depends, right? So if you're going through anything compliance related, or a common one that comes to mind is Cyber Essentials Plus. Mm-hmm. They state within that something along the lines of you have 48 hours to fix critical public facing vulnerabilities, and then I believe you have 2 weeks to fix any other vulnerability, high and critical vulnerabilities that are not external facing.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's entirely logical, right? Because essentially, what you're saying to people is, you should be scanning periodically and every day for these vulnerabilities. You should be keeping up to date with the various patches. Vendors are continually updating their software packages to make sure that they do. I mean, if we both got our phones out right now, I bet we've got a list of vulnerabilities on what you've got.
Let's do it. I have an Android.
You're an Android. I'm an Apple. So
just follow along. I'll go first. Android. If we go to the Play Store and we click on the name icon on the top right, and click on Manage Apps and Device, and you'll see checking for updates. I have one update pending.
Damn, okay.
So it's pretty good.
So mine's quicker. I go straight into the App Store, click on my profile, and it shows me straight away. And I've got 5, so I've got some bigger issues to deal with. Or maybe you're responding to yours quicker.
No, I checked this leading up to the episode a few days ago, and I had 19.
Interesting. But that's it, right? It's that, you should be configuring your devices to automatically, notify when there are updates available, and often you can do them to auto update on your behalf. So that's why it makes sense around the timelines around what is adequate, in terms of responding to a critical facing vulnerability, because especially in that case, you need to at least know about it, right? You either need to have applied the patch, or you need to say, right, there's a reason why we can't apply that patch, so we're going to put this compensatory control in instead. So,
yep, and that goes into your risk management process and your risk accept or whatever.
Yeah. Whereas if you just say, we didn't deal with it, that's not going to be an adequate enough response, and similarly, you're going to face quite a significant fine in that space. So, yeah.
I think we just did a quick test on our devices. I had one, you had 5, but let's say now you've got a company with 20 laptops, 20 mobile phones, bunch of EC2 instances in AWS, maybe some servers lying around. Those all need to be checked for vulnerabilities, and you need the correct tooling to be able to do all of that. Let's say you have a website that's a web application, meaning it allows user interaction and it's not just a marketing static page. Do you have the tooling to scan your web application? Do you have the tools to scan your AWS EC2 infrastructure? Do you have the tools to scan your endpoint devices and find vulnerabilities within that? If you do in-house coding, do you have tools to find coding vulnerabilities? So there's that whole tooling point of view, but then it's a second part is making sure you have a process to fix all of this. I don't know if I touched on this in another episode, a previous episode, or if I was just telling you this, T, but I dealt with an organization in the past who had vulnerability management tooling, had it for years. From the beginning, they knew vulnerability management was important. So they got paid for all of these different tools, and they never did anything with them. They set them up to scan, great. But they had no process, nobody looking after the tools. And when I went into the organization to do some consultancy and help them improve their vulnerability management program, I looked at the vulnerabilities, just highs and criticals, because that was the focus of this project. In these legacy systems, in cloud, in EC2 containers and EC2 instances and ECR containers, there were over 150,000 high and critical vulnerabilities.
That is crazy.
It's an insane amount.
Oh my God. Because that's just, they're finding them and never ever doing anything with them.
So they've got the tools, they're detecting, but nobody's looking at these tools, and there's nobody driving the fixing. They've got no patch management process in place. They're not cleaning up any old. So most of these, I think like 80%, maybe even up to 90%, were resolved by just getting rid of old instances. So terminating old EC2 instances, deleting old containers in ECR. But to do the work, to do the impact analysis, to say, okay, if we turn off this instance, what service will it impact? There's a lot of work that goes into that.
Definitely.
And it's not something you can just say, oh, we don't use these anymore. For some accounts, maybe you can, but for the others, you have to say what's it coupled with, what services is it offering, what do we still use that relies on this ECR, and it takes time. So if you let it build up, it takes a long time to go through all of these in months and months, where it could have taken weeks to get things up and running and fixed.
Yeah, that's just a crazy amount. I mean, I don't even know where you get started with that.
Yeah, so for me, the way I would do it is, or the way I did do it is, I said, you as a company, I need you to list me all the public-facing infrastructure.
Yeah.
And then I want you to prioritize these. I want you to terminate any that don't exist. And that brought the number down significantly, number of highs and critical vulnerabilities. Once we had a handful of live ones still remaining that were actively used or needed, then we looked at two things. Can we patch these and fix them and get them up to a version that was no longer vulnerable? If yes, do it. If no, then we need to rebuild this environment so we can terminate the one that can't be updated.
Awesome.
So again, mini projects. Project 1, get rid of anything old and unused. Project 2, patch the remaining ones. Project 3, rebuild stuff where you can't patch. And then step 4, hopefully the final step in this case is you implement a patch management process. So let's say once a week or once every 2 weeks, there are regular updates done by your system engineers or your cloud platform team or whoever manages those services.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a really important aspect in there around like the life cycle side of things, and that's something that is really in my remit in like cloud security architecture. Is it's not just about what you do with your actual running services. It's okay, how do we make sure there isn't a bunch of shadow IT? How do we make sure that when services reach the end of their life cycle, they're not just sitting around? And then we have this whole dilemma of, okay, is this a problem? We need to do a discovery exercise to figure out what we can and cannot switch off. Yeah, I think it's all falls really under asset management. And I think the bigger you get, especially when it's very fast growth, the quicker it is for things to get out of hand, and you really lose control of the asset management side of things. And then it's a whole rediscovery exercise to figure it out.
Yeah, and we'll talk about I think it's called the pyramid of pain, and step 1 is knowing your estate. So what are your assets? What are you trying to protect? But we'll dig into that in a bit more detail when we talk about building like a SIEM offering.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And asset management is critical to all of this. Whether you're doing incident response, let's say you have an alert on an application. If you don't know who owns the application, what versions it's running, things like that, then you may just be running around for days trying to find an application owner.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I guess the next segue from this then is, okay, we've understood that vulnerability management is important. So who is actually going to perform this? And I guess it goes back to that whole scenario of small versus large organization. I mean, again, you're in a small organization, it's going to probably be, one security professional that probably handles multiple aspects. I mean, they're going to have to, like you said, configure the tool, get up the schedules that they're going to do to scan for these vulnerabilities, have the relevant processes to say, okay, when we discover this level or this severity of vulnerability, what's the service level agreement, the SLA, to actually respond to that? How do we tackle these vulnerabilities? What's our program, that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's that person feeding into that person, so they're the one that's going to have to define it and implement it, which is when you tend to get mistakes, or you tend to get processes up here but not down there. Mm-hmm. So, and that's where the vulnerability management can often get slightly pushed to the side. Especially the easiest way to think about this is, like we said, we gave the example of app updates on our phones or app updates on your laptop. If you're busy, what's the first thing you do? You hit snooze on the update. If you've got loads of time and you've got resource available and you're free, so fine, just do my update now. That's fine. But actually, if you're busy, you're managing the whole process yourself. Vulnerability management and updates, etc., are one of the first things that get pushed to the side, because you say, I'll get around to that tomorrow, or I'll get around to that in next week. It'll be I'll have some time next week to deal with that. And then that's where this window of opportunity presents itself to a threat actor to go and exploit that vulnerability. Because essentially, once it's a known vulnerability, there is literally a recipe cookbook of how an attacker can exploit that. So you're literally giving them the steps to take you down. So yeah, crazy. But then when you move into the bigger companies, you've got dedicated cybersecurity teams. The responsibility of this is going to fall to maybe a specialized VM function, right? So it could be part of your security operations center, your SOC, or maybe you have a specific VM team. I mean, the best protocol is to have a team that focuses on this.
I've seen both where they sit within the SOC. So it's a team within the security operations center who looks after vulnerability management. And then when you identify a vulnerability, something that's been risk accepted, they will work with the monitoring team to set up monitoring use cases. But I've also seen them sit outside and just work independently with teams to implement vulnerability management processes and just fix them, and only work with the security operations center if there's a vulnerability with known exploits out in the wild on public facing infrastructure, especially if it's a high or critical vulnerability, which is then treated as an incident and dealt with by the incident response team.
Yeah, and I think what you've touched on there is really important. Is the whole management behind it, and I think I will say easy. It's not a straightforward thing, but it's a lot easier to set up a VM program than it is to actually run and implement it. Right, so it's very easy to configure a vulnerability management tool, or it is to, have updates available to you. It's a lot harder to actually, implement those processes, do something about it.
Especially in the initial 3 to 6 months where things are a mess and you have to do a lot of work to catch up.
Yeah. And so coupling those teams together, so, like you said, it might be that you have a separate VM team to the SOC, but you want them to kind of work hand in hand together, because then you're feeding in, that context, that knowledge about the business across those different teams. And I think there's always this like diamond, I guess, of security strategy. So you have like the govern side, detect, prevent and respond. And so ultimately from the governance side, you're articulating what it is that you should be doing from a security perspective. That then informs the detective teams what they should be looking for. The preventative side of things, you're saying, okay, we keep detecting these same problems. How do we stop these problems from actually coming up? And the responding side is, well, okay, for things that we can't stop from happening, what do we do when they do happen? And so if you get a nice flow of that going, that then feeds back into those teams, and they can then do something about it and make, risk-informed decisions. But, like as we sort of followed a similar structure to the other topics, we'll go back to it again. You've sold it to me. I've now gathered that VM is important. I need a VM team. What sort of questions should I be asking? What sort of things should I be looking for in potential people to bring in?
And again, I think I'll say the same thing. You want to ask open-ended questions, but I think the key thing here, and it's slightly different to the governance, risk and compliance, where you're setting things up from scratch and you don't have the tooling. Yeah. Here, if you've already purchased the tools, or you made the decision of who you're going to purchase because of some existing partnerships, etc.
Yeah.
You'd want to bring in a person who has experience with that tool set. It's not a huge learning curve, whereas when we talk about SIEM in a later episode, that is a massive learning curve. You want someone who's done that. With vulnerability management, you can get away with people with experience in a slightly different tool set, because the overarching process is very similar, if not the same. Cool. So the configuration may be slightly different, and there may be different ways to run reports, etc. But from a usability point of view, it won't be that difficult for them to adjust to a different tool set. In my opinion, some people may disagree. So what you want to ask them is, if they've used the same tools, then that's perfect. So you ask them, what tools and platforms have you used for vulnerability management? And you want to understand, have they deployed them? So ask them, have you deployed these tools? Talk me through how you went about doing this. What were the challenges and what were the hurdles you came across? What bits, if you looked at different tools, talk me through why you chose the one that you decided to choose, because you want to see whether they're just a person who was just delivering, or were they making these decisions at a higher level? Were they thinking about the functionality of the tool? I think in architecture they call it an ADR. I can't remember what it stands for.
Architectural Decision Record.
Yeah. Which is essentially a list of things that you're looking for and justifying why you've gone with the platform that you've chosen. And it's something we all do when we're going out for new platforms. So in security operations, when I'm finding new vulnerability management tools, threat intel tools, SecDev tools, SIEM tools, I'm creating ADRs. I'm sure you're doing the same in architecture when you're designing solutions.
Yeah.
But you want to make sure that even if they've not used the term ADR, they're still thinking from a strategic point of view about the different functionality and comparing things together, and they can do that work without somebody needing to handhold them, because you're a small business, you can't afford to handhold people at this stage. Talk about how they prioritize vulnerabilities, because when you first start, the biggest issue you have is, what do I prioritize? Like I highlighted earlier, 150,000 vulnerabilities. Where do we start?
Yeah.
If they've not done it before, let's just try and wing it. It's
Number
not the way
one.
to,
Let's go from there.
Yeah, that's not the way to do it. You want to make sure they've created processes. So ask them about the vulnerability management lifecycle. Ask them about vulnerability management processes that they've created. Talk you through some examples. And I also mentioned VM teams working with incident response teams to talk to them about their experience with doing that kind of work. Did they manage it as part of the VM tool? So did they manage their own incident of a critical exposed vulnerability? Excuse me. Or did they work with the incident response team, which they would have done at a large organization? In a small organization, they may run it solo. And a bunch of other questions that are, like I've been saying for the others, we will have a blog series on this roadmap topic where we will ask, highlight the questions we would ask a vulnerability management specialist who's coming in and building your VM function. So that's the key bit here. You want experience of them building the function and not just somebody who's delivered. So make sure they can manage the tools, they can update the tools, configuring the tools. They can then use the tool to be able to read reports. Prioritization is a big element. So if you're prioritizing things from the vulnerability management report, if you work with a managed service provider, they'll send you a report and say, deal with it.
Yeah.
But it then takes a lot of knowledge of your own infrastructure to then prioritize that, because you have to understand, okay, this vulnerability has been found in this instance. They've highlighted it as medium, but because of the mitigating controls we have in place, it's low, maybe even informational, because we have some mitigating controls. And understanding, is there any residual risk from that? If not, then maybe you just risk accept it and close it off. But if you need to, then you're updating that. And then do you ignore this kind of alert from the tool? That person needs to be able to ignore it. Do you lower the severity of this in the tool? Again, you need to be able to use the tool to lower the severity. And these are all things that can be done in the tool.
Yeah.
So it's not a big part of vulnerability management. I'd say the bigger part of vulnerability management is spending the time to learn the organization, the infrastructure, what you have in place, the architecture, so where everything sits. So if you have a vulnerability in one place, how big of a risk is it? Is it exposed externally? So bam, big risk. There's no WAF web application firewall in place in front of this web application. Huge issue. You got a web application firewall that will stop this vulnerability from being exploited. Not as big of an issue.
Yeah. No, really good points.
So we're going to, again, like you said, we're keeping the same structure here. So now we'll talk about how to measure success.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, consistently across a lot of these areas, like I said, you can never really eradicate risk, but the main thing here is to try and reduce the risk, right? So, your security professional, your security team should be looking at a process that is going to work to, help this remediation team reduce the number of vulnerabilities that are existing across your estate. And that's not done by just switching off the tool. Okay, that's the quickest way to get rid of those 150,000 is if we just switch off the VM tool, that becomes zero, right?
If you don't do the scans, you'll never know.
Yeah.
You'll never have any vulnerabilities. Oh,
Exactly.
We've got more vulnerabilities now because we're doing more scanning.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, those pesky scans, right? But again, with all of these areas, right, it's having some clear metrics that you can report and you can track over time. So things like the number of vulnerabilities that you're capturing based on the level of criticality. So typically you'll see like critical, high, medium, low, informational. If informational being, it's not potentially a problem, it's something to be aware of. So something that the software vendor has labeled as, users of the software, be aware that there's this feature that you should consider, but it's not labeled as a severity issue. You've then got things around like your patch compliance rate. So okay, how many issues have we got? How are we actually getting through? What's the percentage that we're actually managing to remediate? The actual time that it's taking to remediate these, that then feeds into the SLAs, right? So, you'll have your own internal SLAs of how you respond to these. Are you actually meeting them? So you say, okay, for all the criticals, we're going to respond to them within a day. Is that actually being translated? Is that actually being seen? Because then, and often we go back to this whole thing of transparency. It's sometimes a nervous position to be in the workplace of not wanting to tell a bad story, especially it's one of the things I learned in statistics is like people will often sway statistics in a way that suits their original point of view, or that will, work with the audience to tell the story they want to tell. And actually the thing you don't want to do is hide metrics that maybe don't shed a good light on the team. For example, if the SLA is saying that we should be meeting we should be patching critical issues within this period of time, we're not doing it within this period of time, that's highlighting there's a problem. Okay, you should be highlighting that there is that problem to senior leadership. So it might be you don't have enough resources within the team. It might be that the tool is taking too long to actually notify you that you've got an issue. It might be that you don't have expertise within the team to actually interpret what's coming from the tool to say, okay, these are the steps you need to do to remediate it. And so
it's understanding the why, so
yeah,
then you can give a solution.
Exactly. And the story is the story. You shouldn't be scared of raising potential security issues within an environment, because if you don't raise them there, it'll get raised in the future as when there is an incident.
Yeah, and that's the security culture piece, right? If you're scared to raise risk, or people are scared to report phishing emails, especially if they've clicked on something,
yes,
because they're scared that something negative will happen to them, or they'll be seen as a bad employee or whatever. That's bad security culture. You want people to report these things so then you can look to fix them. Somebody's clicked on a phishing email and they report it to you. That's great work, because now your security team can respond very quickly. If they ignore it and it becomes an issue down the line, you're now dealing with an incident that you have to fix under a lot of pressure, where you could have fixed it a couple of days ago when the user clicked on the email. And same here, when you're hiding metrics because there's a problem, you're not fixing those problems, and then when it becomes apparent you've been hiding it, that's a bigger problem.
Yeah, no, definitely. So the phishing example is really interesting, because I think most organizations do some form of security awareness training. There is some form of phishing email that goes around periodically, right? And the last thing you want is to scare your employees in such a way that they never respond to emails and they never click anything in an email out of fear that it's a phishing test. Then you're just hurting productivity. What you want to do is, like you said, capture the why. Understand what made them click it. Is it the fact that they're not really aware of the security requirement, or they're not really aware of the security indicators in that email? Is it the fact that they're rushed, that there's a resourcing issue because they're stressed out and they're not focusing, they're not taking the time to actually consider this? And the same thing from a vulnerability management perspective. It's trying to understand why we're not meeting those targets, and that's the only way you're going to get better and improve things. You also want to know what your coverage is, right? So we talked in the last episode about endpoints. You want to know how many endpoints you have and how much coverage you have of those endpoints. The same with vulnerability management. Or you should know what your assets are, what your digital estate looks like. That's step one. If you don't know that, you can't answer the question of what's our coverage. It's no good saying we've got this VM tool deployed. Where is it deployed? Have we got 100% coverage, 60% coverage? There's nothing to work with there. There's no, quantitative information for me. So I think, having a clear view of what our assets are, what our digital estate looks like, and what our current coverage of that is, identifying what the number of false positives are. Listen, as with any sort of security monitoring or security information, it might be that it tells you there's a critical vulnerability. It's not a critical vulnerability, or it's a medium vulnerability, or it's not actually a vulnerability they believed at the time that it was. again, you still shouldn't be ignoring that information. These are things that you should be tracking over time, because you're showing how your team responds to this, how your team triages information and says whether that's genuine or whether that should be deprioritized. And then also articulating the downtime, the impact of this VM process. So like I said, someone is going to have to action these, or in the case of your example, someone didn't action these. So there's a reason why they haven't. Like, it could be a skill issue, it could be a time issue, but you need to be capturing like why they're not being done. And I think often if they are being done, you can look really good and you can say, okay, based on the previous stats, we've got really good coverage for VM, we're resolving them really quickly, everything's great. But are you capturing the downtime, the impact that you're seeing on your security team? Because unless you have a dedicated VM team, they might be multidisciplinary, they might have other things to do, and actually they're being told that VM is the most important thing, so do that, and they're skipping out on other tasks that they should be doing as well. So I think that's how you have a proper process and management, is you understand.
Yeah, and you just mentioned they may be multidisciplined. In a small organization,
They will be, yeah.
The tool will be owned and managed by your security lead, who'll be doing several other jobs, and the patch management will be done by your IT person. I say person because it's one person looking after your IT estate.
Yeah.
And if you have an outsourced provider, then there'll be the people who will be in charge of patch management as well. So definitely multidisciplined. Yeah,
definitely. And I think one of the points to throw in around vulnerability management is something I've seen is the real benefit to it is how it can tie into your other security operations. And one of them I always quite like to see is the penetration testing side of things. So we'll go into penetration testing later on, but the last thing I want to see in a penetration testing report is a load of findings related to system vulnerabilities, outdated software, this kind of thing. Because I know that we've paid X amount of money, a pen tester has spent this amount of time doing stuff, and they've told me what a VM tool could have told me in however long, right?
Yep.
They're not giving me value, okay? Because they're spending their time looking at outdated software. That's what my VM tool should be picking up periodically, and we should be resolving that. I want a penetration tester to come in and start doing more advanced stuff. I want them to
picking up things that your tools aren't picking up.
Exactly.
Because you have processes fixing those things. So the pen tester needs to find things outside of that.
So then you've got that nice, harmonious thing between the two things, rather than, okay, I do a bit of VM, I do a bit of pen testing, I get the same results. You're just spending money in two areas without
you're not
getting
fixing the fundamental issues. There's no point in them finding the more complex issues that you're never going to fix.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's then another report that's going to sit on a shelf.
Yeah, I know for sure. But I think it highlights that, and the thing we wanted to highlight specifically in the foundation side of this series was that, you need to get to a good baseline level in all of these aspects for them to all flow in together. Like, there's no point, having good coverage on like your endpoints if the stuff behind it is all vulnerable, right? So like, okay, your endpoint's nice and secure, but then people could still get to your back-end software. I think it's...
Yeah. So for this, for the fundamental phase, we covered GRC, so governance, giving you direction and tracking what you're working on, risk, compliance, and then we moved on to some monitoring, which is endpoint monitoring with either an antivirus solution or an EDR tool. And then today we touched on vulnerability management. And then the other one that we've mentioned, we haven't done another series on it because we did an episode in the previous series, but that's security awareness, which is the security culture of your organization to report these things when they see them, to make sure your users know what to look out for and feed that back in. And that forms the whole foundational aspect or the foundational phase of your security. So if you've got nothing, start here. Yep. Get your GRC system up and running. Get some basic monitoring on all your endpoints. Get your users aware how to detect phishing and report phishing. And then get a vulnerability management process set up so you can keep everything up to date. If you've got that, you are no longer the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. But like I said, hopefully it's been a really useful series in terms of getting that like the foundations right. But yeah, please do let us know in the comments, and reach out to us if you do have any questions on any of the areas in this series or in the wider podcast. But this has been another episode of the CyberPod with me, Tariq,
And me, Kash.
and we'll see you on the next one.
See you on the next one.